Good morning and welcome. My name is Isabella Henman, your host for today. This is our Student Hub Live broadcast entitled Busting Some Myths About Academic Integrity. And we're running this special session because often students say to us, well, we don't really know what academic integrity means. Often people might be relatively new, people might be from different backgrounds, and they may be just thinking, I'm not really sure and I'd like a little bit of help. So I've got a number of guests with me today who are going to be sharing some of their ideas and some of their suggestions, and hopefully we're going to give you some really good ideas. Now, in terms of some practicalities, you can interact in the chat. You can chat as much as you like, and Student Hub Live is about community, so we do welcome talking about snacks, about animals, about the weather and all things. And when I come to Avril in a moment, she's going to let me know what has been discussed. If you find the chat is moving a little bit too fast for you, then you can see there's a little pin button and that will stop it, and so you can read it, and then when you press the pin again you can scroll back down. And just for practicalities and safety reasons, please don't share any personal information in there. You've got your first names there. Please don't share other things like phone numbers, email addresses, personal information and so on, just to make sure everything's okay. So I said I was going to be coming to her, so Avril has been looking at the chat so far. So what have we been talking about so far? Avril, hello. Oh, I don't think Avril can hear me, which is a real shame. But I know I was told a few things. So I know, for instance, people have been talking about fingerless gloves. Now, these are my very special recycled cashmere fingerless gloves, which I only use for things like this. They're so cosy. And I know people have been talking about snacks. And before we started, I was talking to the different guests and we were sharing what we'd had for breakfast. So I think there was crunchy nut cornflakes, there was crumpets, there was coffee. No, I don't really do coffee, but there was different things. So if you do want to share, we like discussions about chocolate, as long as it's dark chocolate. But just so I know, is Avril able to hear me yet? Can Avril share anything
I
that's been
can.
happening? Lovely, Avril.
Hi, Isabella. So we have got loads of fabulous people in the chat this morning. We've obviously had to have the discussion about weather. So we have got Kim in Shropshire. She's wearing lots of layers. People are suggesting that hoodie is the way forward for sure when it's this kind of weather. Get that on my Christmas list. And we've got Carol in the very wet Scottish borders, but I think the prize so far has got to go to Sawari from Stuttgart, who it says beautiful, lovely, mild day out there and it's sun shining.
We are
So,
jealous.
yeah.
It was raining on my way into the studio this morning. I had my windscreen wipers going super, super, super fast. So thank you. So
Yeah.
Avril I'm going to come to at a number of times. So Avril's sort of my bridge to the chat, but I've also got Joe and I've got Amy in the chat, and they're going to be answering your questions along the way as well. And you can see pictures of them now. They won't be live on camera, but they will be answering questions, and we may have a few other members of the team as well. So my first guest today is John, and John is basically going to be known as Reassuring Uncle John, otherwise known me, because I keep thinking of it as Fluffy Uncle John. But John, tell me, why do you want to be known, when we're talking about academic myths and academic integrity, why Reassuring Uncle John? John?
This came from our earlier discussion when we were preparing, and I was trying to get across the point that this shouldn't be terrifying to the majority of students, that students should be reassured that we want to support them, we want to help them to find out what good academic practice is, and to learn things like referencing and quoting and how to use sources in your assignments. So most students get a bit worried about all of this, rather than let that fear grow. Want to try to reassure people that the university wants to support you, wants to help you. There's a very small minority that deliberately try to cheat, and we try to find those and deal with them. But for the rest of the students who are wanting to do their own work, we want to support you in that. So it's that reassurance that I wanted to give.
Right, thank you, John. And I think that's quite an important thing, isn't it? Because you're talking about the support to help students do things. Now, I know that I will probably come back to this a number of times during the day, but this idea that as soon as you start, you suddenly know everything about academic integrity. You know how to write, you know how to reference. That's not really true, is it, John?
No, absolutely not true at all. And that's why we try in a lot of our teaching materials to provide that kind of guidance. Now, if you're doing your first module, your first undergraduate stage one module, we don't expect you to be perfect. I've chaired such modules, I've tutored on such modules, and generally, right at the start, you're really impressed if people are trying to reference, and you're not getting worried about the fact that they haven't put the quotes exactly in the right places, or the italics or commas or whatever. It's the fact that you're doing it that shows that you're engaging with the process, that you're learning what to do, and we want to help reinforce that and help you to improve.
Absolutely. And I think even if we take this a little bit of a step back almost, so you can see that we've got a question across the bottom of the screen: where would you go for support in writing in your own words? And in actual fact, we're talking about referencing, but we don't actually want to talk about referencing yet, do we? We actually want to talk about writing in your own words. So what does that mean to you, John?
It means that you have read around the subject, you've thought about what you're being asked to do, and you then write what your thoughts are on it. You might have made notes on it, but you don't just reproduce those notes. You provide your own interpretation, your own thoughts. This is my understanding of the things that I have learnt, and so it's as if you were explaining it to a friend or a member of the family.
Yeah, and actually, thinking about that, so there's your understanding, but bear in mind that it's your understanding as a university student, isn't it, John?
Yes, exactly. So you're going to be looking at what the questions are asking you to do. You're going to be making sure that all of the time you are answering the question as far as you possibly can. And you're going to use words that will address those particular issues, but they are not going to be copied straight out of the sources that you have read, whether that's the module materials or anything else that you've seen in other places, books or online.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I was trying to run a tutorial, I think it was last week, and I put in something like this, and I essentially said, oh, what's the relation between twingle wangles and wingle wonks? And students looked at it and they went, we don't know what you're talking about. But that's because sometimes that's how we look at terminology. We see this word twingle wangle or whatever it is and go, oh my gosh, that's really scary, isn't it? That's a piece of terminology, I don't know what it means. I can't use that word. But if twingle wangles or wingle wanks is part of your module, you use those terms, don't you, John?
Mm. Yes, yes, absolutely.
Though obviously they won't
I mean,
say that because I've just made them up. But it's that using terminology, isn't it, John?
yes, yes. You have to remember that this is a university, and we are expecting things that aren't just casual conversation. We're expecting things that analyze the subject, and depending on what your module is, might require you to do extra research, to put together a report, or to solve some equations, and do all sorts of things that you wouldn't necessarily have to do outside of the university. And all of that, whether it's numbers, words, sounds, pictures, reports, anything like that, should be your own work.
Yeah, so that's an interesting thing. So you mentioned equations. Now I know, John, you're involved in maths and computing, and we may have some students here that are thinking, but how do I do that in any different way? Because it is the answer. So can you tell us a little bit about how you would demonstrate writing in your own words when it comes to maths and computing, John?
That's a really important point. So often there is a right answer for a lot of the things that might be asked, but the important aspect of a lot of those questions is not actually getting the right answer. It's explaining the things behind the process that took you to the answer that you gave. So it's not just a matter of saying 2 + 2 = 4. It's explaining the steps that you took to get to that particular point. If it's a computer program, if it's a series of mathematical equations, it's pointing out the various things that the question will ask you to do to show your thinking, to show your working, rather than just doing the giving the answer double underline and rule off, as my old maths teacher at school used to say. So there's I have given marks. I've given high marks for questions, for answers where the numerical answer has been wrong just because of a tiny slip towards the end of it. But the explanation and the working that's been shown has convinced me that the student knew exactly what they were doing and just made a silly mistake. So they lost, a few marks.
Yeah, so that's an interesting point, because I know with some of my students, I'll say, yeah, you got it right, but I don't know how, so your workings. Or equally, sometimes I'll say, yeah, you're right, this is where you've gone wrong, but I can give the marks for the bits that are right because I can see the understanding. And that's what we're trying to convey, this idea about what's gone into here, not what have you read and what's over there. And we've had a question that come in from the chat where where a student has said, when I'm making notes, how do I actually make them in a way that demonstrates my understanding? Can you give us a little bit of an idea about that, John?
And it depends very much on the subject area, and I'm from a STEM background, and so I'm used to things that are perhaps more numerical based, more direct fact rather than interpretation. But we still have a need to write reports. I suppose things like when you are making your notes, if you are using direct quotes, indicate them in your notes, and then look at them later when you come to do the writing up and see, do I actually want to use that quote as it is, in which case I must indicate that it's a quote and reference it, or am I just using that to direct my thinking? And when I use the information that's in that, I will rewrite it. I will say it how I would say it, and I will interpret it in the light of the question that I've been asked. There are other folk that you'll be talking to later who are better placed to talk about more essay-based things, and there's some help on OpenLearn for people who want to learn more about writing in their own words, and indeed that's also in the Student Help Centre. So there's plenty of places to go and look depending on your subject area, and I'd certainly recommend some of the OpenLearn content, which does try to split things down into different subject areas, so that if you're an art student or a social science student or a computing student, there's things there that try to put it into context for you.
Yeah, I think that's a key thing, the context for you. And where you said earlier about that idea about the quote, I know I've had students in the past who've said, oh, well, I didn't realise that I'd copied because I just put that information in my notes and then I used my notes and I assumed because they were my notes they were okay. So it's this idea about not actually copying anything ever into your notes, so that then your notes are genuinely this contextual part of your understanding. So you mentioned those OpenLearn courses, and I think we can show a couple of those on screen at the moment so people can see what we're talking about. So OpenLearn is a bit of a sister part to the university. So there's all my own work exploring academic integrity, which you can see at the moment. The links are available from the event web page, and you can work through these. These are free courses that you can do online, and there's lots of different pieces of information. And there's also the developing good academic practice. Now, I know some of my students and some of my modules actually get pointed to looking at some of the parts of this so they get the understanding. Because it goes back to what we were saying earlier in this that you need to develop it. You need to actually think about it. It doesn't just suddenly come. I wish it did. I really wish we could just say to all of you, here you go, you can just do it. But it's about applying your knowledge. Now, we asked where would be the main place you would go for support in terms of writing in your own words earlier. Avril, what kind of things have been coming? What have students been saying to us?
So we've had quite a few different sort of options in the chat. First of all, what I do need to say, there's a lot of love for John's jumper in the chat and his very reassuring words. So that definitely needs to be fed back. Julie and Holly would ask their tutor for support. Anne-Marie goes to the library for her support. And there's also been a book mentioned called Cite It Right, which some people have come across. Mark is saying that he's really thinking this session is going to be really helpful for the next assignment that he's got coming up, which is great. And then Amy's just reinforcing the message that, this is a skill and people aren't going to be perfect straight away. So to use the resources that are there. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's the key thing. There's lots of resources. That's why John was saying about being reassuring, Uncle John, because we want to reassure you. We honestly, what John was saying earlier about this idea that there are some students who are very naughty and do try and cheat. We're not assuming that anybody watching us wants to cheat. You want to demonstrate your understanding. You want to show how brilliant you are. And how do you show how brilliant you are? By conveying that understanding. What's in there? What's gone in there? Get it out, explain. That's why where John was saying earlier about explaining to somebody else, explaining to a member of the family, explaining to the dog, explaining to the cat, whoever. If you can explain things, it helps. The same way as what we're trying to do today, actually, because we could say, yes, we work for the university, we're tutors, we're module team, we're whatever. We know what academic integrity is. But actually, how do we convey that? We're not just restating that information that you can read in the courses. We're trying to explain it in a way that helps. So John, I know that you also said to me sort of a little bit about, you said to me when we were discussing planning about not fretting the small stuff. Could you tell us what you mean by that, John?
It goes back to what I said earlier about if you are using quotes and you're giving a reference, don't get too carried away by absolutely having the italics and the quotes and things in the right place, but also don't get so bogged down in all of the details, in all of the minutiae, that you forget to answer the question. That's the absolute key part. You can have wonderful use of external resources, perfect quoting, and so on, and yet you haven't answered the question. That has to be the key, and everything else is secondary to it. That you are looking at the question, you're addressing it, and you're answering it in your own words.
Yeah, and that's what we're doing. And it reminds me, we've got an image to show you here, which is this idea about not getting confused. So this image should show the idea of the wood and the trees. So I selected this one because you could look at this image and you may see a wood, a forest overall. Or you may look at it and you may see some individual details. You can see individual trees, you can see little blades of grass, you can see, I don't know what that white thing is in the middle, I'm not really very sure. But sometimes you get so fixated on looking at that tiny blade of grass, of trying to work out exactly where the comma is in your reference, that actually you don't step back. What's the forest? What's the question? What are you demonstrating with that? Now that might resonate with some people. Sometimes when I use metaphors, they help some people, they don't others. But I think that's this idea. So John, does the wood and the trees thing, does that resonate with you at all?
Well, with someone whose surname means wooden village, then yes, I'm very familiar with those kinds of things. But yes, more seriously, it is the stepping back, that looking at the overall picture, making sure you answer the question, knowing where you want to go, to mix the metaphors again.
Yeah, I think, and that's the idea. So sometimes, I know when I used to write essays, I haven't had to write anything for a while like that. But even when I'm planning, so when we were thinking about this session, what do we want to do? What's the message we want to create? And what's the message we want to convey, sorry, not create? So we talked about that, John, didn't we? And what would we like to get over? So actually, we talked about busting some myths about academic integrity. Now, we haven't actually defined it, have we? So John, can you define academic integrity for me?
I mean, if you look online, you'll see all sorts of official definitions. And we're actually having a bit of a debate internally in the university about which words we should use. I'm more comfortable with good academic practice as a terminology, which again brings in what you were talking about earlier, that it's not perfect from the start. It's like playing a musical instrument or learning to drive a car. You pick it up gradually as you go along. So I'd say it's being honest with yourself. It's being honest with your tutor. It's being honest with the university and the teaching materials, and knowing that whether you've got a good mark or not, you've done the best you can with it. So it's your work. It's not other people's content that you've taken from somewhere, from an essay mill site or another student or anything like that. It's a sort of do to others as you would be done by. What would you like other students to be doing? Would you like them to be cheating on assignments? Would you like them to be getting unfair help? Because effectively, as I think one of the chat comments has said, that devalues your own degree if you're trying to behave with academic integrity.
Absolutely, and I think that's the important thing. I know when I did my first degree with the university, I was so proud that I could do things, and I was so determined to demonstrate my understanding, because I wanted to go, look, you know what I said earlier about you all being brilliant. That's what we're trying to do, and we know you're brilliant. We know you are. You know you are. Sometimes you need somebody to tell you you're brilliant, but sometimes it's working out. And how can you demonstrate your brilliance? You may not feel brilliant today, particularly if the weather's been a bit manky. You might be feeling a little bit low, but take the good things, take the little steps, think about think about the understanding. How can you demonstrate that? Now, John was talking about not fretting the small stuff, and he mentioned referencing earlier, and I'm going to come to my second guest, Jess, now. So Jess has got the really, really exciting job of talking a little bit about referencing. So students always ask us about referencing, but students go, well, they think they have to know everything about referencing to begin with. That's not really true, is it, Jess?
Absolutely not, no. Okay, so when students come to us at Access or Level 1, we don't expect them to know how to reference. You know, some of our students might not even know what referencing is, and that is absolutely fine. As John said, we're here to support you and to develop these skills. So it's our job at the OU to develop the skill of referencing and to make sure by the time you leave us, you can effectively reference by the time that you graduate. You know, for anyone that doesn't know what referencing is, it's when you acknowledge other people's work and you provide the reader or the person that's marking your assignment with enough information that they can go away and they can locate the sources that you've used. So plagiarism is what happens when you don't reference correctly. Okay, that's when you might submit an assignment that contains work in there that isn't your own, and you haven't indicated that appropriately to whoever's marking it or whoever's reading it. Okay, so referencing is one aspect of developing good academic practice, which John was talking about earlier. So referencing is one skill that forms part of a wider good academic practice that you will develop throughout your studies with us. You know, it's an essential skill that we want you to learn at university. There's a great video on the library website, so if anybody's worried about plagiarism, then do have a look at that, and it will talk you through how you can avoid plagiarism. And also, don't be scared of referencing. Everybody sees referencing and thinks, oh, but actually it's easy. And that's what you'll discover as you move through your studies. You know, your module materials will guide you on how to reference appropriately. You know, on a very basic level, as John's mentioned earlier, if you take something word for word from another source, you need to pop it in quotation marks and you need to make sure that you reference the source afterwards so that whoever's marking it knows they aren't exactly your words. And even if you follow John's steps and you write things in your own words, your own interpretations, again, just acknowledge the original source that you're interpreting that from. And if you follow those 2 easy steps, you won't go far wrong. So, you know, in reality, reference is something that we teach the basics of, you know, at Access and Level 1. it's important that you understand why we need to reference. So that's a key thing. Not that I have to, but why do we do that? Because it adds integrity to your work. And whoever picks up your essay, so, if I'm writing an essay and Isabella, you pick it up and read it and you think, oh, I want to learn more about that study that Jess has mentioned there, you can look in the reference list and then you can go away and do some further reading and find out a little bit more about that. It's not like John says, you're not going to get referred for an academic conduct case if you've got a comma in the wrong place or a bracket in the wrong place. As long as you've indicated on your work, where there's a quote or where you've paraphrased, then that's absolutely fine.
Great. So you've given us loads to start off with, Jess. So I'm just going to pick up a few things about that. So often students say to me, oh, but I've not got very good marks on this assignment because I didn't reference properly. Now, going back to what John was saying, the referencing is, yes, there will be marks for referencing, but it's not the be all and end all. The writing in your own words and demonstrating your understanding is far more important, isn't it, Jess?
Exactly. Yeah. So you probably haven't been penalised for poor referencing, but if you haven't referenced appropriately or you've used lots and lots of direct quotes, then you're not showing your own understanding. So that's really important. The paraphrasing, the interpretation, that's what's going to gain you the marks, because you're actually showing that you've taken on board, you've absorbed it and you've interpreted it, and you've been able to talk about that in your own words rather than just use the words or ideas of someone else.
You taking on board, absorbing and using someone else's words. I probably didn't get that exactly, but I was trying to use Jess's words there. So we're talking about things, but what is often a challenging thing is there's terminology. So there's academic conduct, there's integrity, there's referencing, there's these words, these terminology we're using today, but it's how you use them, how you explain them. And again, what we're doing today is explaining the concepts to you. The same as if you were writing an essay on what is academic conduct or what is academic integrity and what is referencing. We're actually demonstrating that to you today in this kind of, well, we're going to talk around it. Yes, I'm going to use certain people's words. Yes, we will point you to things. And we've got, Jess mentioned the video. Unfortunately, we can't show you the video, but it's actually hosted on the Library Being Digital site, which you can get to from the OU Library. And hopefully we can show you the front page of that at the moment. It depends. There's certain things we can show and certain things we can't, unfortunately. But the library is the host of all of the information about referencing. They also do live sessions. They do live sessions explaining about referencing and explaining about the concepts. So going back to some of the practicalities of what Jess said earlier, there's actually two parts to referencing. Physically, there's the in-text citation and there's the end reference. The exact format of that is going to change depending on your module. And I know people are probably going to go, but I thought I got it sorted in my previous module. In the reality, if you're going and writing for a journal, I remember when I wrote for a journal, we've got a different referencing style there. So I had to change the referencing. So you'll see we actually had a question for you on the screen, which is, have you ever used a referencing tool? So some of you may be thinking, actually, I don't even know what you're talking about. So Jess, could you actually tell us what is a referencing tool?
Yeah, of course. So referencing tools, or they're sometimes called bibliographic management tools. I think sometimes that's how the library refers to them. So they're digital referencing tools, and they're basically software that you can download, and you can store all your references in there. I've just completed my PhD and I used a tool called EndNote, and I found it really useful. So you read a journal article, and what you can do is you can download that and it will store it in the referencing tool. You can attach the PDF, so you've got the full article there if you want it to. And then there's different ways that you can use these tools. Some people just use them as a very useful sort of storage tool, so you can store all your references in one place. And some people use the more advanced functions, which can cite your references as you go along, and then it will produce a referencing list at the end of your assignment. And what you can do is you can change the format of the referencing. So some of you might know that across the university, we use the Harvard Cite Them Right style. So you'll be able to click referencing style, Harvard Cite Them Right, and it will amend all your references to that particular format. It's not something that you have to do. use a bibliographic tool, but if you're quite digitally literate, then it's a good way to be able to store and organise your references. The library provides a training session. So there's an introduction to reference management tools that's on the library website. So if you think that sounds like something that you might like to do, then go and have a look on the library website and have a listen to their introduction. So there's EndNote. I know some colleagues prefer Mendeley. There's all different software that you can use and download them.
Thanks, Jess. I know I used to use RefWorks, which was the software that the university provided. And then when it changed to Mendeley, I think I had something like 30,000 references that I had to export that I had built up over the years. And I was like, oh, have I really read that many articles? Crumbs, that seemed absolutely loads. I'm not saying you're all going to have 30,000 references. Please don't think that. It was just I was doing quite a lot of research. Like if you're doing a PhD, you'll do things. And we may well have people here who actually at level 3 who are doing dissertations or even postgraduate. So when I was doing my master's, I had to do what we called a mini review or a mini dissertation. And by the time you get to level 3 and masters, you're going to be using a lot more external sources. So where Jess was talking about adding the PDF and stuff, it just makes it easier. It's so nice actually, Jess, isn't it? Having a tool that just does it all for you.
Well, it was brilliant because, another thing I was going to mention today is actually time management. And what happens is I've also been an academic conduct officer, and a lot of the cases that I see coming to me are just where students have run out of time, had to rush and not completed their referencing properly. So my advice would be to make sure that you do your references as you go along. And actually, if you've got a bibliographic tool, it kind of does them for you as you go along. So it means that you don't have that mad rush at the end getting all your referencing sorted. It's not something that you have to do, but it's something that you can think about. And like Isabella said, if you've used references years ago and you think, God, what was that article that I read about so and so, you can actually search within your tool. So I'll think, I read a really good article about injuries in netball, because I'm from a sports background. So I might type in my search injury and netball, click on it, and it will bring that particular article up. So I haven't got to search for hours to try and find something that I read years ago. So I use it like that as well, because my memory is going a bit, I can find things that I've previously used. But it was a lifesaver for my PhD, definitely. So definitely, I think level 3, postgraduate, really useful. At level 1 and level 2, it might be something that's just an extra burden, something that you just feel is more stressful. So just have a think about how you want to use it and whether it's something you want to think about.
Yeah, I mean, reality is we offer all sorts of tools. The university's got lots and lots of things. You don't have to do them all. It's just being aware of them. I think one of the things when we were talking about this, and a couple of things you've mentioned, I wanted to bring into the idea of cultural differences in referencing, Jess. And I know that I remember attending a training thing once, and they were saying that in some cultures, it's believed to be offensive to the original author not to use that author's words. Now, can you explain a little bit about how we operate as a UK university in terms of that culture, Jess?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. And I think cultural differences where people have come from cultures where, like you say, it's disrespectful. They're very used to copying, verbatim out of textbooks, and that shows respect to the original author. Within the UK, that would have to be in a direct quotation. And we try to avoid using lots of very lengthy direct quotations. Like as John said, that doesn't show your own interpretation and understanding. So it's also sometimes referencing can be quite difficult when English isn't a first language for some speakers. So you have the additional challenge there as well. And I think if referencing is something that you struggle with due to those reasons, then speaking to your tutor is key to try and get some additional support in there if you're finding things difficult. There's also additional guidance for referencing in different formats, so accessible formats of referencing if people have particular needs, and again, do discuss those with your tutor. But as well as cultural differences, we also find that students that come to us at credit transfer, so I don't know if we've got any credit transfer students here with us today, but transferring across at level 2 and level 3, they might not have gained the skills. If you're coming in at level 3 with the OU, you haven't had the module materials from level 1 and level 2 that really scaffold your referencing skills and build on those. So again, we often find that credit transfer students need a little bit of extra support as well when they come to us at level 3.
Great, thanks Jess. And I like that scaffolding term. It reminds me back to what John was saying at the start about supporting. Now a scaffolding supports, and we're not saying to you, go off, reference, know how to do it immediately. We're saying to be an effective academic, to be an effective undergraduate student, postgraduate student, whatever, demonstrating your understanding. Part of that is academic integrity, and it is referencing. There's lots of bits involved. Again, I wish I could just magically whiz it into your brain so it all made sense. We're talking from years of experience here. I'm not trying to be facetious in any way or anything like that, but I know it took me absolutely ages. And I remember, and I think I mentioned this to you, Jess, when we were planning, I remember doing essays before I had access to a computer, so going back quite some way. And I used to have the different bits of information from the different articles and then I'd move them around, then I'd go, well, which article was that from? Well, I can't remember where it came from because I didn't reference it correctly because it was on a piece of paper and the reference was somewhere else. So you just have to remember this idea of tools can help you with that, but even when you're doing notes, for instance, at the start of the notes, and I think one of my Access students told me this the other week, they would actually say, right, this is from topic 3, section 2. So they'd know all the notes were from that bit, so it's much easier to manage things. So, Avril, haven't come to you for a while. What kind of things have been talked about in the chat? Have any students used a referencing tool?
Yeah, actually, we've had a few mentioned. So Suwari has used EndNote that Jess was talking about.
Lovely.
Ian mentions Zotero. Yep. And Holly uses Mendeley, and Ian was saying that they all have their pluses and minuses. I think people will probably find benefits to one type or another depending on how they like to use things. Cindy and Rachel are saying that they've found the SHL events really useful and they've been important to help them start on the right foot. So I think we've got quite a good engagement with things that they're doing.
Lovely. That sounds like everybody's being very serious in the chat. Is there no talk of snacks and chocolate anymore, or have you just not mentioned that?
We've kind of, we've pretty much gotten to the fact that there's ginger biscuits are a good one, chocolate hobnobs as well. Yeah. But we're talking about all these lovely academic things at the moment. Yeah,
we're sensible. That's good. I'm
well, it's going to be lunch. It's got to be lunchtime soon, so hopefully we'll start getting some lunch.
Yeah, we might.
lunch suggestions as well would be great.
And you were doing so well about keeping everybody in track, and I've therefore managed to get everybody go off talking about chocolate and cake. We haven't even mentioned cake.
No, well, a vote's just come in for Caramac, which I'm with you there, and that's a strong one. Yeah.
We don't talk about Caramac. Oh, they've been talking about John's jumpers, apparently. Yes, John has lovely jumpers. I'm very jealous of John's jumpers. Then that was why I called him Fluffy Uncle John, because every time I've spoken to John, he's had a different jumper on, and I was like, oh, they're lovely and cosy. And I said if I was there, I'd be going up and stroking his jumper if it was nice and warm. Very inappropriate. You're not supposed to touch people if they don't ask you, but I'd stroke his jumper. Anyway, going back to talking about academic knowledge. Not academic knowledge, academic integrity. I got distracted. I'm too busy thinking about John's jumper. Right, I've got Jess with me now, so my third guest. And Jess, we've been talking about referencing, and we've been talking about how it's actually different for different places and different modules and so on. You've actually experienced that. Sorry, not Jess. Sorry, my brain's gone. That's because I was thinking about the jumpers. Sorry, Zoe. Sorry, Jess, you were all ready to talk to me. It was Zoe. So, Zoe, you've had different experiences of talking about jumpers. I'm so sorry. I'm just thinking about jumpers. Academic integrity, referencing. So, you've had different experiences of referencing. Zoe, I'm going to shut up. You please convey information, not me. Oh, you're muted. I've distracted you so much.
Thanks, Isabella. And I was just saying that I always have to have chocolate when I do a TMA. It's how I get through a TMA. So I'm with all the chocolate chat. As a student, I went from writing a 15,000 word law dissertation to going back and studying a level 1 science module. What I found really difficult is within 15,000 words, you can talk around the subject, you can use contested definitions, but then when you suddenly ask to write a definition in 1 or 2 sentences, you think, well, the book's done this so well, how can I possibly write it any better? And then I had to talk myself down and think, actually, what I'm not being asked to do is write this definition better. What I'm being asked to do is say what I understand by it. And it's only by saying what I understand by it that I can submit that to my tutor. And my tutor can tell me whether what I understand is right or whether maybe I've got it a little bit wrong somewhere. And that's how I can learn about whether what I've internalised, it's not going to be the same as the book. It's going to be quite close to the book, hopefully, if I've got it right. But I can understand whether I've got that concept and I've learnt that concept. So I found it very, very different.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. So it's this idea of using your tutors. We'll come back to that in a moment. But you trying to convey your understanding, and part of the assessment is you're conveying your understanding, and then you're getting somebody saying to you, yes, okay, you've conveyed that correctly. I mean, that's the ideal, isn't it? That you have conveyed it correctly, but it's a learning experience, and none of us will ever do something absolutely perfectly first time through. Sorry if you think you're going to. I don't do things perfectly, even now, as you can tell. But yeah, this idea of conveying your understanding but applying it to the context. So you said this is the difference between postgraduate law, undergraduate science, and actually going, right, which brain am I putting in today? I probably should have put a better brain in today, because then I wouldn't have got so distracted with John's jumpers. But I always think of that, because especially if all of us do lots of different things, there's this idea of multitasking, and many of you are working or caring or volunteering or all sorts of things alongside your study. So, right, which brain am I putting in today? I'm putting in my study brain. Right, what's my study brain going to do today? Probably it's going to go, but when it's done, it's taken some nice deep breaths. It's thought about that lovely picture of the wood and the trees, and it's thought about a babbling brook and thought about all nice things. Right, how are you going to convey? So how do you put your study brain in, Zoe? That's a bit of an interesting question for you.
Yeah. For me, I think it's about when I think about referencing and studying, I think about how I'm going to show you what I understand. And if I write something from the book, that doesn't tell anybody what I understand. But I also like to think that I'm not the first person who studied the subject. I'm only a student. Many cleverer people have studied this subject. So it's really important that I acknowledge that actually when I'm writing something, that these ideas haven't just popped into my brain from somewhere, that actually I've got them from somewhere, and I've got them from what somebody else has written. And for me, when I reference and I write things, it's important to understand where my understanding has come from. Have I taken it from here or there? And to know that I'm not the first person that's ever thought about this. Sure that. Sorry.
I've been being told jokes from the chat, which is really inappropriate because I'm trying so hard to pay attention to you. And then apparently people are lightening the mode about walking into a bar and saying, ouch, it was a Milky Bar. Sigh. I'm so sorry, Zoe. People are not paying attention to you, and they should be. But I think your idea about this, what did you say about it suddenly dropping into your head?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's such an interesting one. And like we said earlier, I wish I could just go zoop and zap it into your head. If you go back when we were doing our freshers session, when I was talking to Gina, and she says sometimes students think that when they register, they click that button or they make the phone call and they say, right, I've registered for the module. Suddenly, somehow it all magically goes zoop, and appears in your head, and you suddenly know how to do everything. Sorry, it doesn't work that way. It is a practice. It's a learning process, isn't it, Zoe?
Absolutely. And I think in that learning process, I just want to understand that I'm building on what's gone before. Yeah. So I'm kind of building blocks, and that I've learnt things from different places, and some of that's common knowledge, so I don't need to reference that. But where I've learnt something really interesting from a specific place, it's really important that other people should have the opportunity to go and find that out for themselves as well. So,
and it's this, almost ask yourself the question. So if you started your module in October, go back. What did September you not know that you now know? Because if you now know it, you've learnt it from the module. Therefore, strictly speaking, you should probably reference it somewhere along the line. There might be certain facts. If you now know terminology, if you're doing history and you know some dates or you know some key people, you've learnt them from somewhere. So you need to reference your module materials. It's part of academic integrity, but it's also, if you've got it wrong, and I had this actually as a bit of an aside, in one of my modules, one of my early modules actually at master's level, we were asked to use a particular article and we referenced it and we gave the information. And what we hadn't been told, if I remember this correctly, is that article had been withdrawn and changed or something. There was something wrong. So by the fact we referenced the information, we were saying, well, this is where we've got it from. We weren't giving wrong information, but it had come there. Now, I'm not saying that you're going to often have articles that are wrong, but sometimes articles do get withdrawn. Sometimes researchers find, actually, sorry, this wasn't quite right, or, yeah, okay, we presented it this way, we found out something different. So it's about academic integrity, and it's about an idea of study community and building on what's come. Now, I'm going to do a slightly more serious thing with you, Zoe. Now, we've mentioned academic conduct, and Jess was earlier saying she'd been an academic conduct officer. Now, we just wanted to give people a brief overview of what happens in terms of the academic conduct process. So, Zoe, can you give us a little bit of an overview about what actually happens to people's TMAs when they submit them?
of course. Yeah, so when people submit a TMA, it's run against two systems that we use. One is called Turnitin, and Turnitin looks at all the other information that's publicly available on the web. So it's looking at books, journal articles and websites. And there's another piece of software called Copycatch. And Copycatch will contain information from students who studied the module before to see, and students who are studying at the moment, and compare all of those to see if there's students who are writing the same thing. Maybe somebody's picked something up from a student that studied a previous year and did a really good essay, or maybe two people are working alongside each other, which is always great until you submit the same essay. So those tools help us to understand that where students might be picking up information, but it's absolutely not about the software. The software is just a tool and it's just a guidance. So what happens next is those software reports go to usually the module chair or another member of the module team. And it's the module chair who will make a decision as to whether that assignment might contain plagiarism or not. So there's always a human check before it even gets investigated.
And that's a good thing. And it's not just with essays, is it? I know in one of my modules that sometimes there's certain key things like a definition. So modules often have a glossary. If you're asked to give a definition of something, don't just copy the glossary definition. Yes, it may explain it for you, but it's about your understanding, where Zoe was saying she wants to know she's understood. So there's going to be words, there's going to be keywords, terminology, but it's changing it around and making it clear that you understand. It's your writing. You haven't copied it from somewhere else. And again, that goes back to this idea of being careful when you do your notes. If you ever copy information from your module into your notes, unless you're very good at remembering what you were doing at that point, and I'm not, if I was doing it, I would use the notes to write. And I know students do that. They use the notes to write. And they go, well, they're my notes. But they're not, because I've copied them earlier. So that's that kind of idea about the academic conduct process. So all TMAs, all work is actually scanned, isn't it? And then that's when, so if something happens, you'll know. And you always get the opportunity to give your side of the story, don't you, Zoe?
Yeah, so if you're writing something like a definition, then when it might come up in Turnitin that actually what you've written is quite close to the module materials. But the chair, when they're looking at the work, will know what the module materials say, and they know to expect certain terms are going to be in there if you've defined the concept properly. So it's their decision then that actually, you've conveyed your understanding by rewording that, and you won't get picked up for an academic conduct investigation for something like that. even if you did, the next stage is where it goes to an academic conduct officer. And the academic conduct officer will do the more detailed stage of the investigation. So they will drill down into the reports to say what's happened here, what have you done, where have you got the information from? Is it reasonable that you have paraphrased that enough, or is it verbatim from somewhere? And what the academic conduct officer can do is they can decide that actually that referral wasn't really a very good one, so they're going to dismiss that and take no further action. They might give you a warning, or what we would call an informal caution at the moment, to say, we do appear to have picked up some references from somewhere. Be very careful and don't do it again. You'll often be sent for study skills support. So study skills support will be a one-to-one session to help you go through your essay, go through some of the things you might have done wrong, and help you to think about how you could change what you're doing in future, which might be, as you say, maybe changing the way you write things into your notes. Maybe I always try to write when I'm writing a TMA from my notes, I always try to reword it into my notes and then reword it again when I write the essay. Occasionally I will copy something down and I'll highlight it or something to show that I've copied that from the module materials. And then maybe I'll talk about it with my other half, or even tell my dog about it, just to say, I don't really understand this. What I think is this. And sometimes just talking it aloud helps.
Yeah, that talking aloud is a really useful thing. Now, some of you listening or watching may be thinking, but I'm not used to this. So there are plenty of guides out there. So where John was saying earlier, we give you support, we want to help you. So there's a link that's coming up, the How Do I Use My Own Words, which is from the Student Home Help Centre. In fact, you can have a look at it now. So this is part of the Student Home Help Centre, where there's lots and lots of really useful information in there. It's explaining things, explaining what we mean by paraphrasing. Now, it's actually an interesting point, paraphrasing. This came up when we were planning. So in some places, paraphrasing is just switching a couple of words around and isn't viewed to be acceptable, whereas paraphrasing, if you step back and how it's explained there, is actually rewording into your own words, but using the relevant terminology. So it's actually quite an important thing to be aware of. It's not just switching things around. Now, going back to what Jess said earlier about time management, often when I've had students who've had any kind of academic conduct case, they've said, oh, but I didn't have time, so I left it too late. Please don't leave it too late. You're never going to do the best possible job if you're rushing it at the last possible moment, because you're not going to have the time to go, step back, right, do I understand? Can I explain it? I always used to set myself false deadlines. If my TMA was, say, due on a Wednesday, I would want to have it done by the Monday, so that then if something happened, I'd still have a bit of chance to go away. It's not fresh in your head, so it's not what you're saying, but you're actually reading what you've actually said, and then you go, oh, actually, you know what, that's not explained very well, or that is very close to the module website. So, Avril, what kind of things have been coming up in the chat? Have we, other than the really, really cheesy joke earlier, have there been, what kind of useful tips or information have we been sharing?
We've had some great tips, actually. Christopher's one, I'm not sure how practical.
Despite your wonderful mic, Avril, you're on mute again.
Oh, no.
It's because you're back. I can hear you now.
You can hear me. Oh, great. Lovely. I'm not sure how practical this one is, but Christopher has said that his best life hack would be to replace your brain with a sponge, and then the information will soak in faster. So I think that's, we can get some of the colleagues around the uni working on how to do that. A little bit more easy to implement. Cindy and Diane use mind maps and spider diagrams and lots of different colour pens to kind of keep track of all the different things. And then we've had a lovely message in from Lawrence, who is really pleased that he's joined the session today. He said he got a credit transfer from Switzerland, and his previous university had very different referencing structure. So he's found that adapting to the way that we do things at the OU has been a struggle, but he finds this session really, really is helping him. Right. So that's great, Lawrence. And then Anne talks to her dogs and they go to sleep. So a little bit of a double bonus there that she gets the info out and the dogs go to sleep. Yeah.
But hopefully, Anne, it's really helpful for you getting it out. Now, I know, I've just got to say, because your mic is so wonderful, every time I look at you, Avril, I think you're going to break into an amazing song or even do the shipping news for us.
Well, It's hard not to. I mean, this day, I did think I said to you earlier on, I feel like I'm kind of on the set of Live Aid and I should be just going, there's a world outside. It's hard. It's hard not to. Shipping forecast, I'm probably, not quite so au fait with, but
Okay,
might happen.
that's fine. We just have to do these little asides here because we're talking about referencing, we're talking about academic integrity, and you know what? They can sound really serious, they can sound really scary. What we really want you to do, the reason why we got John in first, reassuring fluffy Uncle John with his jumpers, is because it's not designed to be scary. Yes, we've just taken you through the academic conduct process, and the reality is everybody does have an academic conduct process. Yes, they do, but the vast majority of students are conveying that wonderful information that they know. They're explaining what you're doing. You are explaining, everybody that I'm talking to at the moment, you're explaining, you're getting what's in here, you're explaining it out, you're showing how brilliant you are. Give yourself time to show how brilliant you are. Make sure that you've actually stepped back, looked at the guidance. Yes, okay, the minutiae of referencing once you get on. Yes, okay, there's specific orders, there's specific pieces of information. That's not the key message. The key message is writing in your own words to demonstrate your understanding, not somebody else's, and then referencing with the in-text citation and the end reference. That's what you're starting with. You're not getting worried. And I know I was talking to one of my students last week who was really, really worried, and they said, oh, I've read about academic conduct now and I think I've plagiarised my TMA and I'm really, really upset. And I said, no, you're not going to have done that. Most of the time, if you're thinking about it, you haven't. Just because you've used a couple of pieces of terminology doesn't mean that you've plagiarised. It means that you've used the relevant terminology, which is great. Anyway, right, I have another guest with me. I've got Laura with me now, and Laura has the most fantastic title. She's part of the Students' Association, but when we see her title, hopefully we'll show it up now, it sounds like you've got a really posh job, Laura. So why are you here talking to us about academic integrity?
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Isabella. So my role is VP Education on behalf of the Students' Association. So I'm a student volunteer. So like many of you on here, I'm a student too. So I've gone through this process a few times. Now, I'm a little bit of a die-hard academic. I'm not going to lie to you guys. I'm on my 4th degree now. I love it. I absolutely love doing research and learning more. But in my role, my major responsibility is sort of representing the student voice. And that works at different levels throughout the organisation. So I sit on things like Senate, but I also have a look at things like academic misconduct and make sure that it's aligned to what the students need. And actually, it's a supportive process. So that's a large part of my role. And I'm here just to sort of be here as that student rep, but also to sort of help with anybody that's in the chat that's got any questions, and also sort of any lessons I've learned over time as well.
Great. So you mentioned lessons, Laura. What would you say lesson number 1 that you've learned as a student in terms of academic integrity? There you go. Lesson 1, academic integrity.
Yeah, no, that's great. So for me, I would say when I very first started doing research and putting together things like referencing, we found it as a sort of a group really difficult to try and sort of understand some of the reasoning behind it. And somebody explained it beautifully to me, and they were like, you are joining an academic community. That's what you're ultimately doing. And in that community, there's etiquette, there's rules. John called it practice. I could refer to it as etiquette, but it's kind of the rite of passage. Now, when you're in higher education, that's part of that journey that you go on. It's not simply a qualification at the end. It's that journey that you take to it. And these are those additional skills that you learn along the way. So if I would say that there was that lesson learned, it's that remember it is a community, which means that there's other people, and I know a few of the others have said it, that have gone through the same process as well. So that's why you have the tools and techniques. So they're all there, and everyone is there to sort of help you along the way.
Right. And you've mentioned this journey. In nearly every session I talk about the study journey. And you are all on your own study journey. We can give you lots of ideas, but it's your journey. Sometimes you will be feeling that you're at the top of the tree from our original image, or if we have an image, sometimes I use in some of the sessions, you sort of imagine a pathway across some hills. Are you at the top of the hill? Are you at the bottom of the hill? Are you just sort of starting out? Are you somewhere along the line? Everybody is on a journey, and your study journey is your study journey. So it's about conveying your understanding and getting some of that understanding. So that's why we have different guests, and Laura's saying what she's learnt and also what other students have learnt. So what would you say, Laura, is the main question about academic integrity that students come to you with?
Yeah, often it comes down to different rules on different modules for perhaps different areas. And I think you've already mentioned it, Isabella. It's really important to point out that there's no single rule across the whole community. So whether you're writing journal articles in one industry, perhaps, even if it's one paper versus an article or a journal that's part of a whole series of them, there's often changes to it, and there's often upgrades. So I will say, generally speaking, it improves over time. But again, I often get asked things like, how do you keep up? How do you do this? And it's also important to mention that actually the OU has put together so many great resources to make that easier. So we do have Cite Them Right. We do have lots of different sort of videos, tutorials, everything to get you closer to that. But yeah, I'm often asked, it's always different. And I wish I could say with my magic wand that it's the same, but sadly I can't see that being the case.
Oh, thanks, Laura. Now, Rachel has said that she currently feels that she's at the bottom of the hill, but she's got some really good hiking boots, and more importantly, she's got some really good snacks. So that's a great idea. So I'm glad that the metaphor's working for some people. But it's this idea, isn't it, that we are on a journey, we're learning. Now, all of the guests today have been saying about that, and I've been saying about that, is that it is a journey, it is a study journey. And I was conscious when Laura was just saying there and talking about the resources. I know sometimes people say, but I don't have time to look at all of these resources. Now, what I would say to you there is, sometimes do you have time not to look at some of them? So what I mean by that is, are you going to spend lots of really, really panic moments at the end trying to work out which reference it was, or have you actually got time to spend 10 minutes having a look at one of the Being Digital resources or one of the things and going, right, okay, I'll get my references in place to begin with. So sometimes it's an idea of you put a little bit of time in to learn something to begin with, and then it helps. I know that if you think about the archetypal IKEA instructions and that kind of things, other brands are available, but how many of us just go, oh, that's okay, I can build that chest of drawers, and they don't read the instructions? So I'm not saying that people aren't reading the instructions, but often we have a tendency to jump in. I know I have a tendency to jump in, and I'm really bad with that because I need to go, no, step back. You know what? I've actually got to do what I'm telling other people to do. Very bad sometimes. But do you ever find, Laura, that you do that you just want to jump in without actually reading the instructions?
Of course, of course. I think everybody gets so excited. And if you're anything like me, you've chosen your module, your course for a reason. It's because you're super excited about it. And this is almost, for many people, just that add-on. They don't always understand why that needs to be the add-on. What I will say, though, is that, like most things, it's a 66-day rule. So it takes 66 days for any person to break a habit. And it also takes 66 days to create a new habit. Now, 66 might sound like one too many. But what I will say is that over time, that actually becomes very quick. Imagine 66 references. You could do that in a handful of your first set of TMAs. So as you're going through that process, like you said, Isabella, it's finding your process. Over the years, I've tried all the different tools. And actually, as it happens, now I just kind of build it into my note taking. So for me, my approach is very much like, as I'm taking the notes or doing my reading materials, I'll literally just add in the citation in my work, sort of as I'm writing notes, so it's all together. I will then put the author. Sometimes I don't even put the year, I just put the author, and then I'll create a little URL link to where that source is. Now, that could be on OU's library, it could be something I found online, and then I do all of my references. Sort of, there'll be a point where I'll be like, my brain's hurting as I'm doing my TMA. I need a bit of, a task to do, so I feel like I'm doing my TMA, and then I'll often spend sort of, that 30 minutes being like, my brain's switched off, I can't write anymore. But actually I could sit and just add in all of the references as I was doing my note taking. So we all need to find our own process, and that's what this session's hopefully going to give people a little bit of inspiration to do, is sort of find your process, what works for you.
Absolutely, and it's what works for you. I can say things, Laura can say things, John said, Jess said, Zoe said, Avril's saying things, but the idea is you need to work out your own process. That's why we've been saying it's a learning journey and it's a process. I know I sound like I keep going on about the same things, but it's this idea that often the people get worried about things because they expect it to be perfect immediately. We don't expect things to be perfect. If you remember, something that Jess said is, when you first come, we don't expect you to know how to reference. It's our job to teach you. So there's lots of different ways that you can look, and it's fantastic we've got people here engaging today, because that means that you're actually spending a little bit of time thinking about that. Have I got those boots? Have I got the snacks? Am I ready for that journey? Or am I actually trying to walk up the hill in flip-flops? If you're trying to walk up the hill in flip-flops, you're not really well prepared. So try and think about the best way to do things. And as a side, I saw a fantastic picture of somebody who'd made a mini pair of furry flip-flops for a cat yesterday. But that's not relevant. But anyway, that just reminded me. So going back to some sensible things. So Laura, because you're involved in the Students' Association, sometimes I imagine you get students who are quite worried coming to you about things and saying, oh, I just don't know, or anything. So can you think of an example where students come to you worried about something to do with academic integrity, and what did you do?
Absolutely. So often students will come to us when they think that they've already made a mistake, and they're in that window where they've already submitted, but they haven't necessarily got their grades back yet. And that can actually cause a lot of anxiety for people when you are really stressing, you think you've made a mistake. And what I will say is that over time, it's all about working out how to build on that anxiety so that it's not there later. So we obviously refer to them to student study skills, and we also encourage students to create their own communities in their modules. It's highly likely that if you felt like that, some other people do too. So it's a good opportunity to sort of share that, and being able to sort of build on, okay, well, what do I have to do next? Another set of students will come to us if obviously it has been flagged. So if they have, for whatever reason, they have been flagged up by Turnitin or one of the copycats, and they're going through an investigation. And again, that can be quite a trialing time for students, especially going through that process. And like I say, here at the Students' Association, we're all about providing you with the support. So we do have individual representation. We do obviously are across different areas of the organisation, so that we are making sure that we're limiting when that happens. And having a session like this and being here today and attending this or watching it back on the recording, that's your first step. You guys are already doing what you need to be doing. And like I said, I'm almost preaching to the converted.
Yeah, but it's a good thing, because we're talking about this as if we know everything. Now, I know I've lost marks for referencing in my work before, and I should know what I'm doing, but I can still do it. But what you have to sometimes remember is don't fixate on referencing as the be-all and end-all. Understanding is far more important. And also, bear in mind, with that study journey, some of you are gently crawling along at the bottom of the hill, and that is fine. Sometimes you're going, you know what, I can just about manage. I'm making progress. It's really slow. I'm actually shuffling along in my flip-flops because that's all I've got access to at the moment. And that's fine. There may be some of you that actually have disabilities. You may have mental health challenges. Even if you haven't got mental health challenges, a lot of us at the moment, when it's rainy in the winter, we all get a little bit down. But what I would say to you, and having spoken to some students about this, is don't fixate on that. Start to build yourself tools, start to build yourself strategies about how you are going to do the best job you can do. On your study journey, where do you want to get to? Do you want to get up to the top of the hill? Fantastic if you do. Or do you just want to get a little bit further? As long as you're getting a little bit further, don't compare yourself to other people. And actually that's probably an important thing for Laura, you to come in on, isn't it? Because often I imagine you found students that that do compare themselves to other people sometimes?
Absolutely. And sometimes they, I've always said it, you are your worst critic at times. So when you are learning something new and you haven't mastered that skill yet, you do give yourself a harder time. And actually, when you compare to others, that have gone through either the same journey, not every student has been through that same process. Not every student perhaps is even studying an area where some, I've often found I'm envious of those that are studying English because they go through so many references because they do significant amounts of reading. And actually, it can be quite intimidating for students if you're in an area where perhaps you're new to doing academic reading. So actually, you're spending a lot of time learning a small number of journal articles well, than having to go, and that's the difference, I guess, between breadth and depth. So I often find that, students will sort of feel a little bit like, a bit like a lost sheep, I don't know, but this person seems to be doing it so well. And, and actually, how can we learn from each other? And that's what's really key. It's about sharing these experiences so that people improve. And I know that somebody else mentioned it as well. It is scaffolding. It's learning over time. That's what's key.
Yeah, and Student Hub Live is about the community. One of the reasons why we have chat is because you're sharing ideas, and it's not saying, look, I'm great, I know how to do this, but I did this and it helped. Or, you know what, I've been trying this and it's not working, can anybody give me any tips? So, as if by magic, Avril, I know you've been managing the chat here and you've got things. So are there any tips? Is there anything that's been coming up in the chat that you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, I've had a hard time getting the picture of cat flip-flops out of my head. So, but I've tried to put that to one side. So we've got, Anne, she tends to do her referencing as she goes along. But a great tip, I thought, was that she puts the question on a sticky note so that she can take it and put it everywhere she's looking, all the materials that she's looking at. So that's really brilliant, I think. Suwari's come up with a great idea. She said that she likes to exchange ideas with others on her course. And to help them do that, she's actually set up a study room for her classmates, an online study room, so they can kind of pop in and out of that, which is fabulous, I think. The importance of reading the question and rereading the question and just kind of making sure you've actually understood what the question is asking you is something that quite a few people have brought up. And there was an acronym that I'm not going to repeat on here that
somebody being
was
naughty,
a little, could have been a bit fruity. Yes, I think, but some great advice going on. Absolutely.
But you know what? Acronyms, when I was originally at medical school, I still remember the very, very naughty acronym to remember the cranial nerves. And I'm not going to say it on here. But let's just suffice to say medical students were very fruity with their ways of remembering. But I actually remember the acronym. I can't necessarily remember what it was about, but however many years later, I can still remember it. So all sorts of things are like that. They're about what helps you. And what we're trying to get the idea about is myths about academic integrity. One of the big myths is that you have to be perfect straight away. Another myth is that referencing is just exactly one thing. And another myth is you will automatically fail if you don't get your referencing right. So what I want to do is I want to have a little bit of a round table discussion now with all of my guests. So I'm going to come to them one by one. So John, what would you say is the biggest myth that you hear about academic integrity? You've changed.
I wondered if you'd notice, and if we do ever meet in real life, you have permission to stroke my jumper.
Fantastic.
What was the question?
The question, because I got very distracted as well. The question was, what's a myth that you've come across about academic integrity?
I think the one that I've talked about already, and that others have mentioned, that you have to be perfect, and you really need to make sure you get everything precisely right, otherwise you will be in trouble. This isn't a sort of police. You're not breaking the law. You're not going to be punished immediately for a tiny little mistake. You're going to be supported. We want to help. So it's more a sort of a feeling that you see in a lot of students, that the whole point of this is to punish students rather than to support them. I mean, there are serious consequences of deliberately breaking the rules, but most people don't deliberately break the rules.
Great. Thank you, John. And you were being really sensible, and I was busy trying to work out what was written down the side of Santa's Spitfire then, and I think I saw it. I get distracted easily. But you know what? That's the reality, isn't it? We all get distracted. When we're supposed to be doing something sensible, something serious, we can get distracted. As a little bit of a hint, if you get distracted by the YouTube rabbit hole, turn off YouTube, turn off those notifications. If you're like me and you go, oh, I'll just go and check this, or oh, I'll just wander. Focus, focus, focus. Anyway, right, I'll try and focus. Jess, what's your biggest myth that you want to sort of dispel or that you've heard about?
Yeah, similar to John, really. I think there's a myth that students think as soon as they start university, they should be able to reference. And that's just not the case. You know, we don't expect students access level 1 to come in with referencing skills. Referencing is a skill that we will look to develop over the duration of your study with us. And there are different expectations at different levels. You know, at level 1, if you're struggling, you'll be offered study skills support. You know, there's scaffolding within the module materials, lots of resources to be able to help you. So it's that you don't have to come in at level 1 being able to reference. We will teach you. We will help you.
At the end of the day, you're coming in to learn. You're coming in to learn content. So you're coming in to learn skills as well, aren't you, Jess?
Exactly. And all our students will come from different backgrounds. So some students, you know, might come in from an A-level background. They might have studied another module somewhere. And so they're coming in and they probably can reference. There will be students that have been out of education for a long time and they've never done referencing before. There'll be students that have come from college courses where referencing might not have been a skill that was taught. So it's our job kind of to get everybody at the same level by the time they graduate. And even now, like you've said, I can't reference off the top of my head all the time. I have to think, oh, well, how do I reference that? That's a strange source. And I'll go away and I'll look up and I'll think, right, that's the way to do it, you know, or I'll be using something from a website and I think, well, there's no author on there or I can't find that. So it's just about thinking, well, actually, is this a worthy source? If there's no author on it and things are a little ambiguous, should I be using this source in the first place? So that's something that we haven't really brushed upon today, but also as well looking at the sources that you're using as well.
Yeah, actually, that's a really good point. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, I mean, in some of my modules, students do something we call the prompt analysis, which is to evaluate the validity of a source and whether it's any good. So is it objective? Is it relevant? Is it timely? Zoe, because you were mentioning about academic conduct and things earlier, and you said you've been a student. What have you found to do with that? In terms of knowing whether your source is any good. Sorry, I should have given you a better question.
That's fine. I think it's looking at, actually looking at how other people use references. Have other people cited that source? How reliable is the journal that the source is coming from? So, you know, you can actually learn about referencing from watching other people reference, and you can learn about how good your sources are from that as well. So, you know, I would expect if a source is 10 years old and it's only had a couple of citations in other places, I'd be quite worried about using it. But if it's fairly new and it's only had a couple of citations, it's been a journal article that's been published within the last 6 months, then I'd be looking at actually what are they citing? Are they citing reliable information? Are they coming from a reliable source? Is it a reliable journal? So you can use referencing and how other people have used referencing to understand whether you can trust your sources too.
Question come in relevant to that, Zoe, is can we use biased sources if we acknowledge their bias? Do you feel qualified to answer that, Zoe?
I would want to turn that over to my academic colleagues. So I think John or Jess is probably better placed.
Which one of you wants to answer that one?
I have actually done that when I was a student, picked in a literature review, picked out ones that I thought were good sources, but also identified ones that I thought were deeply, deeply dodgy, because what I was doing was applying a critical judgment on the subject that I was doing the literature survey for. So in that context, I think it's perfectly okay to say, here's a quote from this source that demonstrates just how dodgy it is.
In one of my tutorials, I mentioned to students, if you're using, for example, a tabloid newspaper reporting on exactly the same thing as a reliable source, technically they've got the same background information, but it's how they convey it. Do they use sensationalist language, dun dun dun, you know, that kind of way that tabloid newspapers are trying to do, or even tabloid, or whichever other ones, I'm not going to mention some of them. But yeah, it's about, you can use bias, it's acknowledging it and recognise it. I suppose it could be a bit more challenging if you don't recognise its bias. And just as a little point here, we've been talking about journal articles and things like that. If you're Access and Level 1, you probably won't be using lots of journal articles yet. You're probably going to be using your module sources and your module website or the books and that. So don't worry and don't think you've got to go somewhere else. You've got the information, but you're still weighing it up. You're going, okay, which piece of evidence is more useful for my context? That was, I think it was Jess was talking about the context earlier, what am I actually trying to do? What is my purpose? Now, if I just step back a little bit, because I was doing the myths, and Zoe, sorry, you're not going to get away with it. What was your biggest myth? I gave you a different question. But what's the biggest myth about academic integrity, Zoe, that you want to sort of bust?
I think the biggest myth that I've heard is about the process. Because people think that if they've been picked up for plagiarism, it's because they've been picked up by a piece of software, and that they've just been unlucky, tripped over a piece of software. But at the Open University, it's not just the software we rely on. If you're contacted by an academic conduct officer, then that's already been through two people. So the chair will look at it and the academic conduct officer will look at it. And we will, at the first port of call, particularly at level 1, is to look at study skills. And it's only really going to go to an academic conduct officer if the case is really severe or if it's been repeated a lot of times. So you're never, ever going to be assessed just on a piece of software.
Yeah, and I think that's an important one. And I know I've had, somebody mentioned essay mills earlier, but there's also various help sites. We don't want to place any credence on them today because they're not a good way. They don't demonstrate your understanding. And my bust is, don't just go to the internet to find your answers, because you run the risk of going down a very poor path. You won't automatically, but there are people that share answers online. They don't spend the time reading the module information. They don't do things, and they just Google it or any other browser, any other search engine. But they go and then they copy what they found. That's not demonstrating good and effective academic practice. And if you keep doing that, that's where Zoe was saying, it's showing. And I have sadly seen students before who have repeatedly done the same thing. And I remember one student saying to me, well, so what? I copied it from a website. And I was like, but you just admitted to me that you've copied it. It's not yours. You're not demonstrating. Anyway, so myths. Laura, what's your biggest myth that you want to bust?
Yeah, I think for me, it's that you're not alone. And I can't emphasize that point enough. You know, you're not alone when you're going through your, note taking, going through that process. And Zoe just mentioned it as well. There are so many good examples out there. Now, if you are a level 1 student, look at the course content. It's been cited. You can learn from the person that's already put that together, and you can see how they're using the sources. Sometimes they quote, sometimes they're paraphrasing. So you can learn from literally just the syntax, the language that you can see from your course content. And if you are at those higher levels, especially if you're level 3 or even the postgrads, find a good journal article, ask your tutors, ask those questions, get a really good one. Because when you do, and somebody's done a great literature review, the way that they've actually used the citations, the way that they've referenced can really help you in your language to adopt as well. So re-emphasising that you are not alone.
Great, thank you, Laura. Now, we've had a question that's come in, which is if you're using a few sources, only a few sources, and you're referencing them repeatedly, how do you practically do this? Now, I'm guessing, Jess, that might be one for you because you were talking about referencing earlier. So, for instance, this is often our level 1 students, isn't it, where they're just using the module materials. So do they reference each and every time? Do they do a general bibliography? Have you got an idea for them there?
So different modules will follow different remits on how you reference the module materials, and that will depend upon whether they are hard copy books or whether they're online sources. If you are referencing sort of the same chapter, it would only appear once in your referencing list. If you're referencing several different chapters, then obviously each chapter would be a separate reference. So that's quite a general question. It would have to be more specific. It's fine if you're at level 1 and you're using the same source several times. So again, but each time you do use something from that source, you would put the author and the year in brackets, and don't worry if the same source comes up. But obviously you wouldn't have to, every time you refer to that in your text, you don't have to put a separate reference in the reference list. And it depends upon what your modules do. So some modules might have a bibliography, which is where they want everything that you've read in the bibliography at the end of the module, even if you haven't referenced it in your essay. I think most modules tend to ask for a reference list, which you only put the reference in the reference list if you have cited it within your TMA. So my advice really would be to look at your assessment guide. In your assessment guide, there should be a section on referencing, and that should tell you exactly what the requirements for your particular module are. So in sport and fitness, we wouldn't request a separate reference for each kind of web page of the study materials. So if you're referencing Pinchbeck, whether it's section 1.2 or section 1.4, you would just have that once in your reference list, but different modules will have different requirements. So yeah, my top tip would be to have a look in your assessment guide, see what the specifics are. If you're still unsure, then contact your tutor and say, I'm using this quote here and this quote here. Does that appear twice in my reference list? Do I need separate references, or can I use the same one? I don't know, different modules, some, if it's an online module, will just want the Open University referencing, and some modules will reference the specific author that's written that particular section. So again, it's just about looking at exactly what your module asks for. I don't know if John wants to add anything to that, because he teaches in a different area than I do.
I was going to say check with your tutor as well, Jess, because some of these things get very module specific at times, and like you say, it does depend whether you're at the start of your career with the OU, or whether you're doing your final project module or something like that. There will be different expectations of you, and your tutor will help. Isabella, if I could just add a couple of tips, I suppose. One is, when I was a student, I had lots of friends who were historians, and the comment that I heard most often when they were writing their essays was that they spent the last several hours looking for the one perfect quote that would make the essay. Don't do that. There is not one perfect quote or anything like that that will show that you have really understood everything. It's not what you quote, it's what you say yourself. And the second point is, and I'm sure Jess would agree, academic conduct officers are real people, and they want to help you. They're not in it to punish students. They're in it to try and help students learn what they should be doing. The whole academic process, academic conduct is part of student support. It might not feel like that when you're at the other end of it, but do remember that the academic conduct officer, if one contacts you, is a real person, and they're doing this to try to help you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, John. That's a really, really important point, because you all want to demonstrate your understanding in the way that you're understanding. Right, now we've only got a couple of minutes left, so I want to come to Avril one last time. What has been there? Is there anything left over in the chat? Is everybody just wanting to go off to do lunch?
We we have got a couple of things in about the order that you should reference things in. So, should it be each separate paragraph quoted as ABC, etc., or should you do separate referencings for part 1, part 2? So, I don't know if there's any quick kind of takeaway on that.
I think the key one is look at your module guidance. Very much look at your module guidance, because as Jess said, in your assessment guide, in the module guide, there will be a section. They are different for different modules. And that bit about the author, so some of my modules are the Open University, some are named people. It will always tell you in your module. So check and use your tutor. Anything else, Avril?
Yeah, just again, a lot of love for John's jumper. That went crazy when he came back on screen. I think, people are just putting in very much that, the library is there. It's a really good resource for anything. I think a lot of the times now, like you said, we tend to head to the internet when actually just across the road there, we've got a fantastic resource of anything that we need. Lots of people asking their tutors for help, and really turning to snacks. At any point where things get tricky, turn to a snack.
Absolutely. Have your study support in whatever format, if that's stroking your dog, stroking your cat, going for a walk. We do other sessions on that. We did resilience, we're doing wellbeing in January. But yeah, putting yourself in the best position to do your best job, demonstrate how great you are. Remember, you're on a journey, you're on a study journey. We don't expect you to know everything to begin with. What we do expect you to do is to learn, to demonstrate your learning. So to make sure that you're using your tutor, asking your tutor, that's what we're here for. We're not just here for the very occasional, oh, by the way, I need an extension. Get in touch with us, ask us questions. Sometimes we will point you to where the information is already provided. Use your tutorials, read the guidance. Now, just as we finish, we do have a survey. So in the chat, there will be a questionnaire just to find out your experiences about today, about experiences about the session, how you found it, so that we can always do the best job possible for you. So I just want to summarise, from my perspective, some of the things that I've heard. So you're not just coming in knowing everything. You will start to learn. We're here to support you. We genuinely are. There's lots of resources out there. Engage with them, spend a little bit of time thinking about them, and then work with them. Because what you're doing, you're brilliant. Remember, you are brilliant. You're an OU student, you're fantastic, and you want to do the best job. And the biggest myth about academic integrity is that it's just all suddenly there. You're on a journey. That journey may have those wonderful boots. You may be somewhere up the hill. You may be shuffling. We like snacks. And my best thing is use the chocolate, because that always helps me. Thank you very much for listening today, and I hope you've had a great time.